right, folks, so just a short little screencast about the friction between the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch. Really what this screencast is about is checks and balances. So if you think about it in terms of the checks and balances system, you really should have no difficulty. Love this image. All right, so when we look at congressional checks over the executive branch, what is the source of friction between Congress and the presidency? We know that the presidency has the power to veto congressional legislation and Congress has the power to override that veto. There are some additional checks that Congress has over the executive branch that creates friction or conflict between the two branches. So number one is going to be their oversight role, the fact that congressional committees have the job of investigating the executive branch to make sure that they are faithfully executing the law as Congress intended. There's that, but then there's the additional investigations of whether or not there was illegal activity conducted by the executive branch. So you got Watergate, Iran-Contra, Benghazi, and then of course there was the 2016 supposed Russian interference in the election. Okay? So oversight itself, that congressional check on the executive branch, is the number one source of friction. There's also the confirmation of appointments. So when you look at the Senate's power to advice and consent, okay, that can be a source of friction. You don't have to go back too far. You look at President Donald Trump's appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court and the contentiousness of the confirmation hearing surrounding that could be a source of friction. We go all the way back to the appointment by Ronald Reagan of Robert Bork. It was a failed appointment to the Supreme Court, but the difference there is that when Robert Bork was appointed, there was still the possibility of filibustering confirmation appointments. So Robert Bork was a conservative justice that just was too conservative when you have to get bipartisan support in order to, work your way around a possible filibuster. In the case of Brett Kavanaugh, the Senate had gotten rid of the filibuster for confirmations, and so there was no possibility. And then also, both Congress and the executive represent different constituencies. The president represents the national constituency, 325 million, if not more, constituents as a whole, a national viewpoint, which often conflicts with Congress because, yes, the Senate is supposed to have a lens towards what's good for the nation, but the House definitely doesn't. The House, by design, is looking out for local interests, and that can often lead to a conflict because what is good for the nation as a whole isn't necessarily good for your congressional district back home. All right? And then there's the effect of divided government. Rarely when we talk about, eras, oh my word, party eras, I forgot the term there for a second, right? If we really think we're in a sixth party era that's characterized by divided government, it's something the American public wants and likes as an additional check on the power of government. You're going to have the presidency controlled by one party and at least one house of Congress controlled by the opposite party. So it's very hard for them to actually craft legislation unless there's bipartisan support behind that. And in fact, the Congress is always looking to retain and make sure that their party controls the presidency as well. So if you have a Congress that's made up of the opposition party, sometimes there's a stonewalling effect. We're just going to make sure that this president doesn't have any legislative successes. So when it comes time for re-election, there's nothing for them to campaign on. That could be a possible effect of divided government, which would lead to friction. Because the president would say, here's the agenda, I have a mandate for it, I was just elected, and you're stonewalling me, Congress. You're not helping me achieve what the people want. All right, we also look at friction between Congress and the judicial branch. All right, so in that case, I should go back for 1 second, I'm sorry. One that's not listed here is that Congress controls the appropriations, right? They're the ones that control the power of the purse. They're the ones that fund, they give all the executive branch the money that the president needs to execute his agenda. And you might look at the case of a source of friction between Congress and President Trump is Congress was passed a budget that did not include money for the construction of a wall along the Mexican border. And the president, not getting the funds that he wanted, used some of his powers to declare a national emergency so that he could take money from one area and use it to build a wall along the Mexican border, which was not what Congress intended, which of course creates friction. So when the president actually uses his own executive powers to declare national emergencies, to pass executive orders, to get around what Congress might intend, that creates frictions between the two branches as well. You just have to go back to the famous Federalist Paper 51, right, where it was ambition will be made to counter ambition. Both of these branches are ambitious, okay, and which often leads to friction in and of itself. So friction between Congress and the judicial branch. Again, Congress has checks over the judicial branch that can create friction. Now, it's not as severe friction because the justices, for the most part, are going to be nonpartisan, right? They're ideological, but they're not necessarily aligned with the political party. And they have life terms, so they're very hard to remove from office, right? But Congress does have some judicial powers. They can establish courts lower than the Supreme Court. They can determine the pathways by which cases would lead to the Supreme Court. They have some power in drawing judicial districts. So when we talk about the structure of the national judiciary, we've got the circuit court districts, we got the United States district courts, like the areas that they're responsible for. All those areas, those geographic boundaries, are controlled by Congress. And of course, Congress determines the salaries of the judges. And then there's the Senate confirmation appointments, the fact that they become rather contentious and a part of political theater, you would say. And maybe there's some grudge that's held by a judge that had to go through that theater and then is confirmed to the Supreme Court. Do they hold a grudge? Well, I would say more likely than not. They're probably above those kind of petty squabbles. Okay, passing laws to limit judicial discretion. That is something that Congress can do. So they used to be that a judge sitting on a certain type of case would have a lot of discretion in determining what the sentence would be if a person was found guilty. Well, Congress, within their powers, can actually set what we call mandatory minimum sentencing. That, you can't give someone convicted of this crime less than this amount of time in jail, okay, which limits the discretion of our federal judges. And then, of course, Congress is able to propose amendments to the Constitution, which could be a slap in the face to the Supreme Court. I don't think most justices would view it that way. They view their job as to interpret the Constitution, and if Congress is able to propose an amendment that does get ratified by the states, they would just see it, okay, this is the will of the people. Now we have a new Constitution to interpret. But the example here is an interesting one. So Texas versus Johnson was a Supreme Court case that said burning the United States flag is a form of political speech and is protected under the First Amendment. So Congress can't pass a law that says you can't burn the flag or that there'd be punishments for someone who's engaged in the act of burning the flag. It's protected political speech. Well, in response to that ruling, Congress did propose an amendment to basically say that flag burning was something you couldn't do. Okay. All right, so trends in congressional approval. So the other thing we want to make sure that we're aware of when we talk about friction between the presidency and Congress is the president's job approval rating, even when it's at its lowest, is nowhere near the job approval rating or disapproval rating of Congress. So Congress actually sometimes has a lower job approval rating than some authoritarian dictators around the world. Okay? So you'll look at, here's a nice little chart that shows you that the approval rating for Congress hovers around 20%. So now this conflicts with our understanding of re-election rates, right? So we know that in the House of Representatives, an incumbent is re-elected like in the 90th percentile. So 90% of all incumbents are re-elected in the House, and in the Senate, it's at least in the 80th percentile. So Congress gets re-elected at a very extremely high rate, yet the overall approval of Congress as an institution is extremely low, 20%. What accounts for this? Well, basically it works like this, is that Myself as an individual, I approve of my particular representative. I have a high approval rating of my representative, of my senator. But when I look at the dysfunction of Congress as a whole, I have a low approval rating. Okay, if I could just get more people that believe like me elected to Congress, my approval of Congress would go up. That's generally what people think. Okay, but we know that the country's split. Okay, so how do you account for these spikes here? You'll see that at one point in the early 2000s, Congress had an 84% approval rating. That's huge. Well, I don't think it doesn't take too much stretch of the imagination to go that approval rating was probably connected to events that happened in 2001, right? You think about 9/11 and the passage of the Patriot Act, that when Congress does respond to national emergencies, their approval rating goes up, especially when they work in a bipartisan fashion. Okay, so source of disapproval, partisanship, polarization. We know that Congress is more polarized than it's ever been. And we know that polarization is when the political parties ideologically are moving away from each other. They're moving towards their ideological extremes. And you can see that in this chart. This is not the first time we've seen this. That in the past, when we look at like the 50s and the 60s, there was a lot of dispersal. So individual Democrats, individual Republicans weren't so ideologically extreme. There were a lot of moderates, and a lot of times they overlapped, right? So there was a lot of areas in which compromise could be built. The ideological gap just wasn't there. If we look at the 90s and into the 2000s, right, we see huge ideological gaps. We see there's more uniformity in what the Democrats believe and what the Republicans believe. There's less people in that moderate zone. There's less room for actual compromise. And if there's no compromise that can happen, then Congress really is a dysfunctional institution, or the public might view it as a dysfunctional institution, and that might explain the low approval ratings. Okay? So some ideas to reform Congress. How could we possibly change it so that its approval rating and its effectiveness as a governing institution could increase? The number one idea that you will hear thrown around is term limits. So right now, there's no limit on the number of terms I can serve in the House or the Senate. I can be reelected as many times as the people want me to send me back to serve, right? Well, maybe, we put a limit on that. Maybe you can only serve 4 terms in the House and like 2 terms in the Senate. Would that create more opportunities for compromise, get more ideas in there? The drawback to term limits is you're limiting the amount of time for any one representative, any one senator to really develop expertise in a particular area of the law. And we know that the law is just too large, too big for any one senator to know it all. So if you can only serve 12 years in the Senate, does that really allow you the time to develop the expertise that is needed to craft legislation that is beneficial for the country as a whole? Now, eliminating the revolving door. We haven't really talked about interest groups yet, but the revolving door is this concept that people, as they leave Congress, they get hired by interest groups that then lobby Congress to try to get their legislative agenda passed. Well, who makes the best lobbyists? But former representatives, former senators. So they go from working in the public sector to working in the private sector for an interest group, and that way there's this revolving door between public servants and private individuals that are all trying to craft policy for the interests of a particular group. So making sure that you can't do that, or setting limits like once you leave Congress, you can't actually work for an interest group as a lobbyist for 5 years, 6 years. Those ideas have been thrown out as well. But again, the drawback to that is you're limiting these people that have worked in Congress for a long time. They're experts in a particular area. They've developed relationships that are effective. Maybe we should let them be lobbyists because they have the expertise to craft legislation that might actually be good for the country. Okay? Or maybe that interest isn't reflective of the entire country as a whole, but just a particular group. Right? There's that issue to discuss. Campaign finance for reform. We know that money plays a huge role in who wins elections, and we've tried it several times to limit and define, okay, how can campaigns raise money and who can spend money on advocating for a particular candidate. Right now, Citizens United limits any of our ability to kind of limit campaign finance reform, that particular court case. Eliminate gerrymandering. Maybe if we took the drawing of districts out of the hands of state legislatures and put it into the hands of impartial, nonpartisan groups, we would get districts that maybe are more moderate, that aren't necessarily safe, that and maybe we would end up with a Congress that isn't as polarized if we changed how we actually go about the drawing of districts. Why don't these happen? Because in order for them to happen, you would need a majority in Congress to actually approve these items, right? And once you're the majority, then you're like, well, we were able to come to a majority using the rules that we currently have. Why would we want to change the rules? That would shorten our time in the majority. Okay, that's kind of a pessimistic view, but there you go. Okay, and that's it for today. So just note that when we talk about the frictions between the legislative branch and the other branches, we're really just talking about the checks and balances system. Know your checks and balances, okay? Can't recommend it enough. Just something you want to memorize. All right, talk to y'all later. That was just a short little lesson for today. Go play out in the cold. Should be fun.